Before we had all these incredible interactive dashboards and self-service analytics tools, a totally different kind of battle was being fought in the world of business intelligence. It wasn't just a fight over data, it was a fight for control, and it was waged over every single pixel on the page.
And this isn't some dusty old history lesson. For any IT professional who was actually in the trenches back then, this is a shared, almost traumatic memory. This one sentence, man, it just perfectly captures the frustration of what became known as the pixel-perfect war.
So what was this war all about? Well, it happened in a time when just getting data out of a system and onto a piece of paper, perfectly formatted, was a massive, massive undertaking. And for businesses, this wasn't just a nice-to-have. It was a matter of survival.
I mean, you can just feel the pressure coming from all sides here. You had executives demanding these flawless, print-ready reports for the big boardroom meetings. You had regulators who needed ridiculously specific layouts for compliance. And who was stuck right in the middle of all of it? The developers, just trying to make it all work.
And that really is the bottom line. This wasn't about finding some cool, hidden insight in the data. This was about the absolute fundamentals of running a business. If you couldn't produce these reports, you couldn't operate. Period. This was the critical infrastructure of the company. Now, at the very heart of this conflict were two absolute titans of the industry, and they each had a completely different philosophy on how reporting should be done. So, let's meet the combatants, Crystal Reports and Cognos.
Okay, first up, you have Crystal Reports, and this thing was everywhere. It came bundled with huge platforms like Visual Basic and SAP, so it kind of became the default tool for tons of developers. And at first, they loved it. It had this drag-and-drop interface that seemed so simple. But that love often turned to pure hate when they slammed into its legendary formatting quirks and performance nightmares.
So what was the one thing that drove developers absolutely bonkers? You might think it was some super complex coding challenge or a massive database query. Nope. It was something much, much simpler and way more infuriating.
That's it. That was the nightmare. You could spend days, literally days, building an incredibly complex report, just have the whole thing completely fall apart because one little text field was off by a single pixel. It was fragile, it was maddening, and it was an unbelievable waste of time.
And then, in the other corner, you had Cognos. This was the total opposite. This was the big enterprise heavyweight. If you were a CIO, Cognos was the dream. It offered centralized control, security, scalability, all the good stuff. But for the developers on the ground, it felt like bureaucracy turned into software. It was complex, it was slow, with a super steep learning curve, all for the sake of top-down control.
And this right here really gets to the core of it. This was a philosophical divide. Crystal was all about simplicity first, empowering the individual developer to get things done quickly. Cognos was all about scalability and governance, enforcing strict control from the top down. It was a fundamental clash in how a company should even approach its own data.
So, how did this big philosophical war actually play out inside real companies? Well, as you can probably guess, it got messy. It became a constant battle between speed and control.
The central conflict really just boiled down to this one question. Do you empower your developers to move fast, even if it means reports might be a little fragile and break sometimes? That's the Crystal approach. Or, do you lock everything down for the sake of stability, even if it slows innovation to a crawl and drives your developers crazy? That was Cognos.
The crazy part is, most big companies couldn't choose, so they ended up using both. You'd have the central IT department carefully managing the official reports in Cognos, while different business units would go rogue and spin up their own shadow IT, using Crystal reports to get things done faster. This created massive data silos and, you guessed it, endless political turf wars over whose numbers were the right numbers.
So, after all that fighting, who actually won? Was it Crystal or Cognos? Well, here's the wild part. Neither of them did. The war didn't end with a clear victory for one side. It just stopped.
Because while these two giants were locked in this epic struggle, the world around them was completely changing. New technologies, new ideas about data, they were all bubbling up. And suddenly, the whole concept of a static, printed, pixel-perfect report started to feel, well, old. And then, a new guard showed up. Tools like Tableau and Qlik burst onto the scene, and they just completely changed the conversation. The focus wasn't on perfectly printed pages anymore. It was all about interactive, explorable dashboards. This was the beginning of the self-service BI era, where everyday users could finally ask their own questions of the data without having to wait for a developer.
This timeline really puts it all into perspective.
You see the war peaking in the late 90s, then boom, mid-2000s, the disruptors arrive and change everything. By the late 2000s, the old titans get bought up. SAP grabs Crystal, IBM buys Cognos. And by the 2010s, it's a whole new world. The age of the interactive dashboard was here.
So, the final verdict is pretty clear. It wasn't that one side beat the other. The very thing they were fighting over, the pixel-perfect report, was just becoming obsolete. The war ended because the battlefield itself simply disappeared.
But the legacy of this whole war is maybe the most important lesson in tech. Managing data is never just a technical problem. It's always been about politics, it's about governance, and it's about the very real pain of the people who actually have to use these tools every single day.
So yeah, that particular war might be over, but those underlying tensions between control and speed, between governance and usability, they never really go away, do they? Which really makes you wonder, with everything happening with AI and data privacy, what's the great data war that we're fighting right now?